is that when I submit my reading list to the prison authorities, they have no idea what are in these books. So I write up a very boring survey of American history and our three branches of government, and it gets approved, and then I give all of my students the People's History of the United States. I'd given my students the syllabus, and there was a Wednesday that I wasn't there. I was in Montana. And I got a phone call in the hotel room, and they said, this is the Special Investigations Division of the Department of Corrections of the state of New Jersey, and do you know that your students just led a sit-down strike in our prison? And we think you're behind it. Crowd psychology under Le Bon, Trotter, Sigmund Freud, and others, passed the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act. And when you go back and read the radicals of that period, Randolph Bourne or Jane Addams, they decry how effective that system of mass propaganda was, which appealed, of course, to how people feel. That people were not moved by facts or reason, but by that manipulation of emotion, and how effective it was in turning even socialists and the intellectual class behind the war effort. And they write with some despair. And we entered after World War I a period MacDonald describes as unique in modern history, and that is a culture gripped by what he calls the psychosis of permanent war. He said none of the political theorists of the 19th century, including Karl Marx, anticipated the psychosis of permanent war, where the day World War I is over, the dreaded Hun becomes the dreaded Red. And after the war, they shut down Appeal to Reason, which was a socialist journal with the fourth highest circulation in the country. They shut down the masses. They deport Emma Goldman and Berkman and other radicals in the Palmer raids. Eugene V. Debs at this point is already in prison and will sit in prison until I think it's 1922. And that was the time in which these movements that had opened up our closed system, and our system was designed to be closed. You read the Federalist Papers, and there is a deep and abiding fear of direct or popular democracy, and all sorts of mechanisms put into place to prevent that possibility, including the Electoral College. That's how Al Gore gets 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush, and George W. Bush is appointed president by judicial fiat by the Supreme Court. A movement outside of the formal structures of power in an election cycle. Syriza started polling at 4%. 10 years later, they took power in Greece. And that's how we have to begin to think, to free ourselves from the highs and lows of American culture. We have to stand fast around these moral imperatives. We have to begin to build a movement by which power is frightened of us. And that's Karl Polanyi in The Open Society and Its Enemies. He says the question is not how do you get good people to rule. Most people, Polanyi writes, who are attracted to power are at best mediocre and usually venal. The question is how do you make the powerful frightened of you? So as Ralph points out, our last liberal president was Richard Nixon. Not because he was a liberal or had a conscience, but because he was frightened of movements. I saw for the book Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, I was down in West Virginia with a guy named Ken Heckler, who was in Congress, and unlike the current politicians from West Virginia, didn't work for the coal companies. And he authored and got on Nixon's desk the black lung compensation legislation. And Nixon didn't want to sign it. And Heckler told me he got up and held a press conference and said, if the president doesn't sign it, there will be a nationwide coal strike tomorrow, and this country will be thrown into an energy crisis. And Nixon signed it that night. And Heckler said, I didn't really know if there was going to be a... That's how power works. There's a scene in Kissinger's memoirs, do not buy the book, and Nixon has taken empty city buses end to end around the White House, and there's tens of thousands of anti-war demonstrators, and Nixon's wringing his hands, looking out the window, going, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that's just where we want people in power to be. That's our job as citizens. And the job of corporate politicians, and I'm going to have to include Obama, is to deliver credulous voters before the altar of corporate power. And they have run scenario after scenario. The militarization of police forces, Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which, as you heard, I sued Obama in federal court over. This was a section that overturned the 1878 Paz y Comitatus Act, which prohibited the military from serving as a domestic police force. A terrible dilemma. The Obama administration appealed. They didn't just appeal. They appeared at her chambers the day she issued a temporary injunction invalidating that law. And they said, you must put it back into effect immediately in the name of national security. And instead of the federal attorneys, they now had attorneys from the NSA. And Judge Forrest, to her credit, refused. That was a Friday. 9 a.m. Monday morning, they were in the Second Circuit Appellate Court making the same request, and unfortunately the Appellate Court agreed. Why? Why? We knew they'd appeal. And the only assumption that the attorneys and I could make was that they're already using the law. That there are most probably U.S., Pakistani dual nationals in black sites somewhere. And if that injunction was allowed to stand, if they got out, they could hold the government in contempt of court. That it is not our job to take power. It is our job to keep power in check. And let me here commend the activists in Seattle who shut down that highway. And that is what the establishment in this political moment fear the most. They fear that we will step outside that system of managed democracy, that political theater, and find our own voice and our own power. And they're frightened. And they will work very, very hard to sell you once again the mantra of the least worst. But look at our own history. Every time we vote for the least worst, it gets worse. It doesn't work. every despotic regime that falls, every revolution that succeeds, as Crane Brinton and Jeffrey Davies, the great theorist on revolution, have pointed out, succeeds when significant sectors of the foot soldiers of the elite, the civil service, the bureaucracy, the police, refuse to defend discredited centers of power. And that is why I believe they passed Section 1021 of the NDAA. They don't totally trust the police to protect them. We went to Pelosi during that 2-year battle and we said, when you renew it, all you have to do is insert into that section that this does not apply to U.S. citizens and we will drop our lawsuit. But of course they did not, because it was written for U.S. citizens. The Chicago teachers march through the streets. They go to the precinct houses, and the police applaud. I was arrested in front of the White House a couple years ago with 133 others, most all of whom were veterans, protesting the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And as they cuffed us, it turned out those police had been in the National Guard, they'd been in Iraq, they'd been in Afghanistan, and they would whisper, "Keep protesting." When we were arrested in front of the Congress, as we were being escorted out, one of the police officers turned and said, "How do we get money out of politics?" And that's why nonviolence is so important, because it is about the good drawing to it the good. And it's not easy, and I am acutely aware of the violence that police employ against the poor, and in particular poor people of color in this country. And yet, at this moment in history, those who hold power are morally bankrupt and have been exposed. And if we can recover the moral force to resist, to carry out sustained acts of civil disobedience, to create third parties outside of the system that give expression to those movements, then we can use the word hope.
Right. Than they were before.
Right.
So,
well, let's be clear about what happened. The international banking system, which really doesn't give a damn about the Greek economy, I think it's 2% of the EU, it's insignificant, understood that this was a political war. That if Greece was allowed to walk away, Portugal, Spain, Ireland were all going next. And so they went to the Greek government and, in essence, the Greeks bring in hundreds of tons of produce, all of their pharmaceuticals, and they said, you will end up like Salvador Allende in 1973 in Chile. You won't have any gas, you won't have any food, you will have power outages, we will destroy you. And they would have.
The democracy rally, the 16th to the 19th, what was the turnout for that? And then secondly, can we get this done without a French-like revolution?
I don't think that we can work with corporate power. I think corporate power must be destroyed or overthrown. I'll repeat that for the Homeland Security person. That's overthrown. No, I think we've reached a point where the system is incapable of internal reform. And I obviously want to see a revolutionary movement that's nonviolent. And I watched it in Eastern Europe. I mean, in the Stasi state of East Germany, which was the most efficient police state until our own. And there, it followed the classic pattern of revolutions whereby, as the demonstrations grew in Leipzig, Erich Honecker, who'd been the communist dictator for 19 years, sent down an elite paratroop division to Leipzig to shoot the crowd. And when the paratroopers got to Leipzig, the Communist Party officials in Leipzig forbade them to deploy in the streets. And Honecker was out within a week. These regimes that are this decayed, as ours is, can crumble very quickly. Once those who are tasked with employing the brute mechanisms of control will no longer do so. That's how the Russian Revolution was a non-violent. Yes, there was anarchist violence, and Alexander II was assassinated, but it fundamentally fell through non-violence. When the Petrograd bread riots happened, the Cossacks were sent in, and they refused to fire on the crowd. So the Tsar is up on the front. They shove him in the imperial rail carriage. He abdicates on a railway siding. He didn't even make it back. That is true in every revolution. So once the system is discredited, we had 500,000 people in Alexanderplatz in East Germany, 500,000 people in Wenceslas Square in Prague, and that discredited elite. And it doesn't matter how many weapons they have. The Shah of Iran had the fourth largest military in the world at the time. But once he fled, the armed forces issued a statement that they would not protect the regime. That is how revolutions happen. It gets into the Bolshevik Revolution, which, as Adam Ullman, the great scholar of the revolution, says, was in fact a counter-revolution. The destruction of decentralized power, the Soviets, Lenin and the Bolsheviks create a paramilitary faction with the Red Guards. They go in October and violently take control and then impose a form of state capitalism. And revolutions are always susceptible to counter-revolutions. This is what happened in Romania in particular, which I also covered, where Ceausescu was overthrown. You had a few days where workers took over the factories, and then the Securitate showed up again. But we have more power than we, I think, and once we begin to exercise that power, it becomes apparent. You can see it on video, probably on YouTube, but Ceausescu would hold his annual meetings when they'd bus all the workers into the square, and it's an amazing moment in history, and he's up on the balcony with his wife Elena, and eventually the crowd just starts booing and hissing. It was unthinkable in Romania. And you watch him in a panic, and you watch him in the microphone suddenly start offering reforms. And then he's helicoptered out in a post